Right, so the Forde Report, the KC-led inquiry into the findings of a leaked report on bullying, harassment and racism in the Labour Party. Remember that one. It did not deliver the results Keir Starmer and his team desired, though. The leaking of the report, commissioned under Corbyn's leadership by then General Secretary of the party Jennie Formby, blew open a litany of racism and abuse, and whilst Starmer has spent the last several years fixated on who leaked that report rather than the contents of it, which he had demanded be shelved, only in the last few weeks finally giving up on that pursuit after blowing more than £2.4 million in Labour Party funding, members' dues wasted incidentally, when the bigger point to anyone not a complete sociopath, or come across as one anyway, should have been the contents of that 860-page report that was leaked showing systemic issues with Labour's factionalism and control-freak right wing. Regardless of Starmer's preferred fixation, though, the report contents demanded an investigation, and he was forced to commission what became known as the Forde Report, a KC-led inquiry into the harassment and racism exposed in the earlier report, and upon the findings of that report not being what Starmer wanted to hear either, that was shelved and allegedly not acted upon either. Well, now it turns out that ignoring the report was one thing, but Labour's ongoing treatment of Martin Forde, the author of the report bearing his name, has been the subject of legal threats over his findings, and being black himself, it seems his report has only been proven all the more true when it comes to Labour's hierarchy of racism. Right, so the Forde Report is back in the news during the general election campaign, and this is never a good thing for Keir Starmer when it comes up. At the time of it now, even less so. Forde's inquiry, a thorough and comprehensive investigation off the back of previously made allegations of racism, misogyny, bullying, intimidation and harassment, detailing who conducted themselves in such an appalling manner by doing this, right down to WhatsApps exposing them from the period coming to light against various individuals, perhaps the best known being Diane Abbott, and who behind the scenes of the Labour Party machine were making these comments, staff members and people in positions of influence. Keir Starmer was forced into commissioning this Forde Report after the initial expose, the Labour Leaks Report commissioned by former General Secretary Jennie Formby, called the Leaks Report because it was leaked shortly after Starmer became Labour leader. People who saw it, read it, they demanded an explanation of the Labour Party, and Starmer really hoped that the Forde Report would exonerate his faction and place the blame where he wanted it, on the rotten lefties he had pretended to be one of to get into the position he conned his way into, as hindsight and 10 abandoned leadership pledges have demonstrated in part, if not in full. The Forde Report didn't do that, though. 165 recommendations made by Martin Forde KC for the Labour Party, changes that he felt it needed to make, were outlined to end what his report called a hierarchy of racism, including, as for instance, the use of blind CVs when it came to recruitment, so that discrimination based on race or any other reason might not happen. An example of one recommendation Labour admits to not having implemented, though has now claimed to have implemented 154 of those 165 recommendations. His treatment of Martin Forde himself, though, means taking Labour's word for this is a little bit challenging, and I certainly don't buy it. The report was not received favourably by Labour when it came out, you see. The media also completely ignored Forde when his report came out in 2022, and after several delays, and once it did come out, it wasn't hard to see exactly why that was. Starmer allegedly banned his own MPs from being able to speak to Forde in relation to it. Requests to meet with Martin Forde by members of Labour's National Executive Committee were blocked, as this excerpt from The Independent interviewing NEC member Mish Rahman, talking about a letter Forde was sent, which I'll come on to in a moment, explains. Mish Rahman, a member of Labour's National Executive Committee, NEC, told The Independent he was disappointed by the letter to Mr Forde. This legal threat from the Labour Party to Mr Forde is consistent with the behaviour of Starmer's Labour Party, which is intent on cracking down on any dissent or criticism rather than the actual perpetrators of racism, said Mr Rahman. We also saw this in the party's pursuit of those it believed had leaked evidence of racism and its defence of those who had made racist and bigoted comments. Mr Rahman claimed that Mr Forde had been invited to attend NEC meetings on several occasions, but that Sir Keir and his General Secretary had refused to allow it. He said, as a member, I received countless correspondence from members about the delayed Forde Report into racism in the party. It is now clear as day that Forde was suppressed by Labour's leadership, and that they have attempted to cover up the report's disgraceful findings by stopping Forde from meeting the NEC. Under Keir's leadership, the party operates a hierarchy of racism, where it doesn't take anti-black racism and Islamophobia seriously, and instead punishes those like Martin Forde KZ and Faiza Shaheen who bring evidence of racism to light. The irony and double standards are astoundingly laid bare. Legal threats, Damer? What's gone on here then? Well, following the mainstream media completely ignoring this hierarchy of racism that a respected King's Counsel like Martin Forde had exposed within the Labour Party, Al Jazeera Investigations added an extra episode to their well-respected and in fact award-winning docuseries The Labour Files, where they sat down with Martin Forde and he was finally able to give his opinion on his own report. And he spoke of being blocked and the lack of engagement with him from the Labour Party and his recommendations that his report had made, barring actual debate at Labour's top table on what are incredibly serious matters, which Labour largely disputed. A particular note was Forde's criticism of Labour's handling of anti-Semitism, the epitome of that hierarchy of racism, it seems, since Labour put allegations of anti-Semitism before other forms of racism. And Forde himself described the anti-Semitism training provided by Labour via their chosen faction, the Jewish Labour Movement, calling the training they provided largely didactic, top-down and one-dimensional. It was following this programme that it has now emerged Labour made legal threats to Forde for going public and talking about the hierarchy of racism he found in the Labour Party, where it came from. Well, Labour weren't talking to him, and if there is a party that wants to take power and run this country, if it has inherent issues with racism, with weaponising it, with not treating all forms of racism as equally awful, then we the voting public, need to know about that, do we not? Instead, following that Al Jazeera Investigations episode being broadcast in March of 2023, Labour sent Forde a legal letter, basically accusing him of having acted against the party's interests, and that they were considering all legal options. Lawyers apparently accused Forde of having made extensive negative and highly prejudicial comments, because overseeing a hierarchy of racism isn't prejudice at all then, I suppose. After ignoring Forde, it seemed like they were considering suing him even for finding uncomfortable facts about them out and going public with them. Nothing quite screams we're implementing recommendations like sending out legal letters against the bloke who happened to point them out to you. And when you refuse to engage with him or discuss these matters with him, he takes up an offer from a foreign-based media outlet to talk about it, and you can't whinge about it later then, can you? You had your chance to engage with him, you instead chose to ignore him, and he didn't particularly want to be ignored when his findings were so serious. Here's what he told The Independent. Speaking to The Independent this week, the respected barrister said, "I don't know if it was an attempt to silence me. I mean, they couched it carefully along the lines of, 'We're reminding you of your professional duties,' which I found mildly irritating because I am a regulatory lawyer, and I don't like my professionalism or ethics being questioned, but I felt it was more." He continued, "I'm a private individual. They can't silence me. I fundamentally object to people saying to me, 'You don't know how to behave as a professional.' I'm afraid that black professionals get it all the time." The hierarchy of racism experienced in his professional life as a black barrister, a KC therefore, I'd say equal to Starmer, but frankly he's better than that by a long shot in my view. Not a high bar though, I realise. But he'd know it when he saw it, arguably as well as anyone possibly could then. Not just because he's black, but because as a black professional he's experienced it in that capacity as well. So when called upon to investigate it and seeing it within a political party, of course he's going to know it when he sees it. But instead of taking him up on his report and his recommendations, Labour chose to ignore him, only now as recently as January just gone announcing they'd implemented any of these recommendations. But I'd want another Forde report, frankly, to believe they'd done that. But not only did Labour ignore him, but when a media outlet gave him their attention, that then invited potential legal action against him from Labour. If this is supposed to make us think that Labour is truly dealing with its hierarchy of racism, threatening legal action against a black lawyer who carried out a report that they commissioned that they just didn't like the findings of just tells me it's very much still going on. Arguably no finer example of that continuing to this day has been the purging of so many ethnic minority Labour parliamentary candidates and the desertion of so many Muslim voters. Faiza Shaheen, the failed attempt to get rid of Diane Abbott as well, the excusing of conduct of right-wing MPs, white ones as well, from like Steve Reid to Barry Shearman. But Lisa Nandy, herself mixed race, had a go at Jewish Green Party candidate for Birkenhead, Joe Bird, this week, over alleged Green Party anti-Semitism, because it's being tried on with that party now as well, weaponised once more, but attempting to goy-splain anti-Semitism to a Jewish person when you aren't Jewish yourself was not a good look for Nandy whatsoever, as this video recommendation will tell you all about, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.